Welcome to the Tudor Dixon Podcast. Today we are going to talk about exactly how all of this messed up stuff in government happens under your nose without you really realizing it, but it's actually costing hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars to the left to do this. And we're not seeing it. But Tyler O'Neil, thankfully, he actually broke it all down for us in a new book called Woketopus. He is the senior editor at the Daily Signal. And this book, I've been reading through it. It's exactly what I want you all to know. And I didn't know exactly how to break it down, but it's all here. So thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for writing this for us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Tudor.
Yeah. So, I just want to dig right into it, because I think what is most shocking is the amount of money that goes into making people believe that they naturally decided that they were pro-trans activism, anti-Israel, all this climate stuff. The amount of detail you get into is astonishing, because I just don't think people really realize it. But when you see the money, the hidden money, the whole Arabella system of how this money goes in. I think you even have like the National Wildlife Fund in there, which is billions of dollars goes in there. And people, you hear that, you think that sounds so wonderful, because I think of like bears and lions and things being protected, and I go in there and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is just a total disaster for fake climate stuff.
Yeah. Well, and what you've seen over and over again is these climate groups, these green activist groups, they started with noble goals, often trying to tweak one or two things to protect a few endangered species here or there. And then they got almost captured by this ideology that says all human impact on the environment is evil. And this overlooks the fact that human beings have been taking care of the environment in good ways that help the environment for as long as we've existed. Like if you look, there was this fantastic book talking about kind of the secret history of the Native Americans and the tribes that we were able to figure out here. Forest management, the controlled burns and the managing of the forest to prevent devastating wildfires goes back to pre-Columbian times, where people were managing the forest because they knew that it was important. And so the very thing that, Gavin Newsom needs to get into his head right now is the same message that the Native Americans knew a long, long, long time ago. But the money that's being directed to these things truly is gobsmacking. And the degrees to which these big funders go to hide where donors are sending their money is all. You talk about the Arabella Advisors network. Arabella Advisors, for those who don't know, it's a for-profit company that set up a whole bunch of nonprofit companies. And then those nonprofits direct money to their own fiscal sponsorships. So you have like this tripartite structure, and there are at least 6 of these sister nonprofits. Some of them are bankrolling many of the ballot initiatives that we've seen, like when Ohio went for abortion, that was bankrolled by the 1630 Fund. You also have these nonprofits propping up these groups that just exist to oppose President Trump's Supreme Court nominees back in his first term. And then you have some of them that are coming out and saying they're demanding transparency from Justice Clarence Thomas while running as far to the hills as possible to avoid their own transparency, showing where their money is coming from. And so this is the hypocrisy on the left. And I don't think that dark money, as it's usually called, is inherently nefarious. But I do think it's quite revealing the degrees to which these organizations go to hide where donors are sending their money.
Well, it always makes me laugh because you hear the radical left yelling about dark money on the right, but it is really, there would be no radical left. There would be no rise of the radical left without the dark money of the left that has come in. And this organization, it is so massive. And when you talk about it creating these other nonprofits underneath, I look at Michigan, we had the same abortion amendment here in Michigan. We also have, it's so far and wide. It is organizations that create organization on the ground to go make sure they're door knockers and that and whatnot. But it's also newspapers and news sites and everything you can think of to impact people and make them believe this is a legitimate site coming out and say, I mean, they send out newspapers to your house. I had people that when I was running for office be like, I got this new newspaper at my house. It's not a newspaper. It's from a nonprofit that is supporting the candidate on the left. I mean, it is so far and wide and you don't really realize it. And they're even using our taxpayer money to do it because you go into the public unions. And that to me is so shocking how much money the public unions are handing over to Democrats, essentially Democrat candidates, so that they can beat out the Republican candidate, even though the members may not be for the Democrat.
Right. Well, that's a big scandal that thankfully the Supreme Court created a pathway to get some people out of unions who didn't like when their union, it was called agency fees. So there are like levels of corruption to this, where that was called Janus v. AFSCME. Really important Supreme Court case. Unfortunately, a lot of unions are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that their members can't opt out of spending agency fees and can't opt out. They can't leave the union. But yeah, one of the big aspects of this book is that a lot of the money that is funding the Woketopus, these activist groups that infiltrate the federal government, and right now are gearing to oppose President Trump from outside and from within. But we have a deep state effort that's gearing up to oppose Trump right now inside the federal government. But these activist groups get a lot of their funding from unions, and the unions give charitable contributions to all of these activist groups that are help propping them up. So you might have, you're a teacher in Ann Arbor and you're a member of the American Federation of Teachers or the National Education Association. You don't know that a bunch of your union dues that you think you're paying so the union can advocate on your behalf to get you better wages and salary and benefits, that those union dues, at least in part, are funding efforts to crack down on oil and gas, to make it harder for you to drive to work, efforts to demonize conservatives in federal law enforcement, efforts to push transgender ideology through every aspect of the federal government and through, human society. I mean, we talk about the Human Rights Campaign, which is one of the big drivers of gender ideology. They're forcing essentially companies, terrifying companies, into buying every aspect of this. So when you had Target and Bud Light going whole hog in 2023, and then they suddenly lose a whole bunch of their customers because Americans don't want to put up with this stuff. It's this basic disconnect between the elites that are pushing their ideology on us and the American people who say, no, we like our cars. We don't want to be lectured about gender. We want to be left alone. We want to be able to make money for our families and find our way in the world. Most Americans don't want to fight these ideological battles. And that's why the influence of the Woketopus is so important to expose, because it's happening. And most Americans don't know that it's happening, that this is a conscious effort to force these ideas and these policies on the American people.
So, and this can be happening in your company too. You may not even know it, that the Human Rights Campaign, these groups, they infiltrate your organization. So we have like corporate institutions like John Deere and Ford and those companies who were being kind of held hostage by these groups. Like, we have so much power that we can debank you, we can affect your customer base, we can do all of these things if you don't abide by our surveys and you don't go into our, and they have this public announcement of who has been a good corporate a partner to them. And that has been devastating, I think, to so many of these companies, because they feel like, they have to spend money to have these groups. So you had all these organizations, all these big corporate institutions that had these DEI programs. And it's funny as I watched Donald Trump sign the, we're getting rid of all of the diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates in government, you take a step back and you see that some of these companies last summer already said, we're going to get rid of this stuff. We're getting away from the HRC. We're going to just step up away from all of these radical programs that aren't actually helping our companies. In fact, they're hurting our companies, because I think that when you saw last year, suddenly people started to say, what happened to Boeing? And I think Boeing was an interesting situation, because Boeing actually cut corners. They made the critical corporate error of deciding safety was going to be secondary and put everybody in danger. But it was at the same time when people were questioning, are you hiring people because they're qualified, or are you hiring people to check boxes? Yep. And I think so many companies looked at that and went, oh, shoot, we do not want to be in that situation where somebody peels back the layers of the onion at a John Deere or a Ford and suddenly goes, you hired people that had no qualifications to do something that puts people at risk every day if you're not careful.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is the big takeaway from DEI, is that it moves limited resources away from things that really matter and away from competence. And it directs them toward these ideological agendas, which, I grew up in the 90s. So I remember being told, and I love that this was drilled into me, because I think it should be drilled into everyone, that you should be judged according to the content of your character and your competency rather than the color of your skin. And then somewhere around 2020, a whole bunch of people thought, oh, because of George Floyd, we need to go to racial quotas, and we now need to judge people based on the color of their skin, not the content of their character. And I'm like, weren't we all told from an early age that it's important that we treat people equally, that we be colorblind, that we make sure that we value your contributions and your abilities more than your race? And DEI flips that on its head. And, you talk about the Human Rights Campaign, and this organization, they require absurd degrees of, virtue signaling, essentially, from these companies, where they have what's called a corporate responsibility score. And so these companies, not only do they have to have internal policies that say, you can't fire someone for identifying as gay or transgender or whatever. And it's like, okay, I could see a little bit of reason for the Human Rights Campaign to ask a company for that. But the Human Rights Campaign also says you have to, in your public statements, in the money that you send to in your contributions, in the way that you present yourself to the world, you have to be whole hog in this movement. And
but how did they get so much power? I mean, this is not the government. Why do they have any right?
Movement. Yeah. So it's because the elites above us essentially decided, and a lot of the big venture capitalists created this ESG movement. And they said, we are going to direct our money based on environmental, social, and governance goals. And every company has to be woke in order for us to invest in that company. And the Human Rights Campaign was a major driver of this and achieved a great deal. And we saw, thankfully, John Deere, some of the companies that you were talking about, pulled out of the Human Rights Campaign's index last year. I think we need to have more and more of that, because this index still has far more power than it should. And unfortunately, a lot of those companies, and every company that withdraws from that index, is a victory.
Why does it have power, though?
Naturally conservative.
I ask, why does it have power? Because, I mean, it means nothing to me as the consumer. Right. Certainly, if I'm going to go buy a car or Harley Davidson or go to Lowe's, I don't care what that index says. So why does it actually have power? Because if we're a free market and government shouldn't get involved in private business, and this is just some random nonprofit organization, why do these companies feel like they owe them anything?
The short answer is they have power because they're perceived to have power. The big answer is the ESG movement, which thankfully is weakening, the DEI initiatives, which thankfully are weakening. But of course, they're going to fight to maintain them. I mean, a lot of companies are still getting really high human rights campaign scores, despite what happened in the past 2 years. And I think this movement, and that's one of the importances of my book, is that this movement is not going away. These activist groups are going to continue. I mean, the Human Rights Campaign, I call it the LGBTQ mafia because of what they do, the way they hold companies hostage. And unfortunately, they're still going to have influence. We have to, and the Trump administration is doing an excellent job, President Trump, with those executive orders, fighting down on DEI in the federal bureaucracy. But those executive orders have to be followed. I mean, there's a recent poll that shows 64% of DC-based federal bureaucrats who voted for Kamala Harris in the last election said they would not follow a lawful order from President Trump if they thought that it was bad policy.
But okay, so policy has now and laws have now kind of gotten away from the legislative branch of government. The legislative branch of government was the lawmaking branch. Now
Yes.
agencies have come in. So when we talk about the deep state and we talk about the bureaucracy, agencies have become so large and so powerful at the federal level, but also at the state level, that these agencies are making rules, way more rules than we see bills going through the legislature. And these rules have the same impact as breaking a law.
Yeah. Yeah, they are the rules that Americans have to live by. So this system is, I mean, it's a holdover from the industrial age and from it was called the progressive movement. Now today's progressives are taking it to insane lengths. But, you know, when you're talking about the progressive movement, Woodrow Wilson and then later FDR creating this vast administrative state. And at the time, they really trusted in top-down bureaucracy. They believed that there was one truth that the experts would know, and the people just had to accept it. Now, with the advent of the internet, with the strength that we have of the American people being able to learn through open platforms like X, I think COVID really ripped the Band-Aid off and showed how much undue authority these agencies still have. I mean, we had the public health experts telling us that they lied to the American people. I mean, that I think people forget. First, they said, don't get masks because masks aren't effective. And then they said, do get masks because they are effective. And why did they say don't get masks originally? They said because we lied to the American people because we were afraid that the American people would buy masks and then all the doctors who needed the masks wouldn't be able to have them. And it's like, when you do that, when you admit that you lied, and then you constantly get on your high horse and say, I am the science, listen only to me. I mean, that is not.
But they lied about, I mean, they allowed the teachers union to come into the health department and dictate whether or not schools could be open, knowing that schools could be open, but allowing the union that brings a lot of money to the people who are in these positions to dictate whether or not our kids would go back to school. And I hear what you're saying, but it seems like from the George Floyd and COVID-19 situation that were both kind of happening around the same time, since then, the power became stronger. And I guess it's because Joe Biden was in the Oval Office and he was allowing the power to get stronger. But I mean, my gosh, this is a man who declared Easter the transgender day of visibility. It's like shocking.
Yeah, it was. And the book explains all of that, why the elites favor these policies. I go into the education issue in COVID in my second chapter of the book. And I talk about how these teachers unions that were demanding schools be closed. And, you know, they claim they had a reopening plan in the Trump administration that had all these things that had nothing to do with reopening. And then it was very political against Trump. And of course, Trump wasn't going to adopt their reopening plan when they're an aggressive stature against him. And then they started getting money. And I really think it was kind of a shakedown where they said, we're going to keep schools closed until we get enough money from the federal government. And eventually they did. And if you look at the amount of money that was poured into these programs to fund schools to help them reopen. Under Biden, it skyrocketed. I mean, it had started under Trump because he signed the CARES Act, but it really reached insane levels under Biden. And this was in the same administration where Biden took the heads of the NEA and the AFT to the Oval Office on the very first day of office and said, you're here in the Oval Office with us, and we're on your side. And this is the guy who said he was going to be the most pro-union president ever. When you talk about unions, Joe Biden means the union bosses who funnel their money to the Democratic candidates, who funnel their money to the Woketopus. He doesn't mean the average man and woman who's working for a living, who may be a union member because that's their best option. He doesn't mean those people. He means the bosses.
Well, and one arm of the Woketopus is taking money while it's handing money to the other arm, because let's break down the union, for example. I mean, you did have them demanding all this money going to schools. Mysteriously, the money that went into schools that you would imagine, okay, so the kids are behind, they have to get caught up. These kids that were younger in elementary school, they didn't learn to read. We've got to get them back on track. That none of that money went there. And suddenly you talk about the Ann Arbor teacher. Well, that teacher who's putting money into the union, which the union already has all of this money in the teachers or in the administration's head, suddenly massive amounts of money to play with. The schools never got better in that period of time, which is interesting because that goes against the whole argument that if you just keep pouring money into schools, that's the only thing they need to make sure they have high test scores, but that's certainly not true. But then you break it down and you say, okay, that teacher in Michigan who puts money into the union, then the union passes that money to another arm of the Woketopus that goes, okay, we've got to be obsessed with the climate, so we're going to shut down gas-powered vehicles, and we're going to start only making electric vehicles. And so all of the students' parents who work at the factory down the street in Michigan, suddenly that factory is being obsoleted because they're going to build one in Tennessee. It's like, oh my gosh, do you not see how this is working? But we don't, because it's behind the veil. People have to really understand what is going on and dig into this like you do in this book to see, holy cow, none of this is occurring organically. None of this is natural. This is all this is well-funded propaganda that goes through multiple different areas and gets to the people in multiple different ways and gets to the corporations. I mean, how could corporations be duped into thinking that they have to have the score from the HRC if they do not have a massive amount of propaganda hitting them every day saying you have to do this because it seems ridiculous. It's not a real thing.
Yeah, it is. And on the climate issue, is a massive amount of propaganda. I mean, and it gets even worse. Not only is the money from the Ann Arbor teacher going to the Woketopus and then going to these activist groups that are pressuring the government to shut down opportunities for oil and gas, but we also have this orchestrated campaign where, under the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the biggest lies the Biden administration told, they said, we have to pass this bill to lower inflation. But what was the bill actually doing? What did Biden brag about as soon as it was passed? He said this was the greatest investment in climate infrastructure in a generation. And so you look at all that money, and who is the one who decides where the money goes? None other than, hold your breath for this, John Podesta, the guy who led Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, the guy who founded the Center for American Progress, which is an organization at the center of the Woketopus, an organization that pushes for all of pretty much every single issue that I outlined in the book. The Center for American Progress is a driving factor. Open borders, climate crackdowns, pushing gender insanity. And he's the one, and he is very well connected to the big donors at the top of the Woketopus. People like Hans-Jörg Wyss, who's a Swiss who came to the United States. We don't know if he actually became a United States citizen because he still hasn't told us. But he's the one who's been bankrolling a lot of these ballot initiatives.
But if he were on the right, everybody would know if he was a U.S. citizen. Because if he weren't, he would be thrown out of here.
just like Charles and David Koch. Everyone would know that, oh,
Right.
Hans-Jörg Wyss is having this huge impact. Just like Harlan Crow. We know Harlan Crow's name because they've been demanding transparency. But, every time you talk about George Soros, they say that you're an anti-Semite. It's like now it's not even George, it's his son Alex who's running the Open Society Foundations. And he said,
And actually funding anti-Semitic protesters.
exactly.
You can't make it up.
You can't. Yeah. I love a few months ago, Ted Cruz was attacked for being anti-Semitic because he was talking about George Soros funding this anti-Israel. And it's like, I'm condemning anti-Semitism on college campuses where Jews are being harassed because they're perceived as being Jewish and perceived as being Zionist. And people are accusing them of genocide. And you're saying that I'm the anti-Semite because I'm calling out the money stream that's behind this.
But you are finally also calling out the money stream behind it. And this election was very unique. I think a lot of people came out of this election feeling like, oh my goodness, America has seen what's really going on. But it's tight. You have 77 million that voted for Trump and 75 million that voted for this crazy stuff because they are so manipulated by it. I mean, prosecuting pro-life protesters. This is all about these ballot initiatives. So you go back to the massive amount of money that goes into a ballot initiative. And we're talking about tens of millions of dollars that go into these ballot initiatives. So if you think it's just a bunch of people that are like, we want to protect your rights, it's not, it has nothing to do. They don't actually care at all about abortion. They want to get voters and they want to be able to use something where they can twist your mind around it to the point where you think you have no choice. And so they went to the extreme of saying it is so important that people abort their babies that any protester legally protesting at an abortion clinic should be arrested. I mean, gosh, I think it was just this week that Trump said, okay, we're going to have, or I guess just last week that Trump said, we're going to release 23 or 27 pro-life protesters. Yes, exactly. These people were in prison. I mean, it's shocking. We talked to someone last week who was saying, he was a guy that had been one of the top 10 or top 20 mobsters in the United States. And he said, what I see in Biden's government is very familiar because it's very much mob-like behavior. And that's exactly what we see with taking these people who are legally protesting and throwing them in prison.
Well, and turning a blind eye to the vandals who attacked pro-life pregnancy. Like the unspoken fact about the FACE Act is that both the Trump Department of Justice and the Biden Department of Justice said that the FACE Act applies to protecting both abortion centers and pro-life pregnancy centers. So why the disconnect? Why are you throwing so many pro-life protesters in jail for standing outside and praying or getting inside and peacefully doing a sit-down protest in an abortion center? And then turning a blind eye to all of the fire bombings, the vandalism, the attacks. We had, I think it's almost 100 attacks on pro-life pregnancy centers and pro-life organizations after the leak of the Dobbs opinion. And then more than 200 attacks on Roman Catholic churches around the same time.
I have to say, when I read your book, I think, gosh, we haven't done this very well. I know it happens on the right as well, but we certainly have not done a very good job of showing people what a life is and the value of a life because it was so effective. The abortion campaigns were so effective that I saw women who were like, throw those people in jail. Total disregard for the Constitution or our actual rights. These people actually have rights. They don't care. They're like, I don't want anything getting in the way of me and this ability to do something that they will likely never do. That's the bizarre part about it. Likely the people who are fighting for abortion will probably never have an abortion. but they will gladly take away someone else's rights so that they can make sure there are no barriers to it, which I just find bizarre because one right is not more valuable than the other. And yet the left has convinced people very well that your right, this right has more value than this right, or that they don't even know their rights. They have made it so that the education system doesn't even let you know what your rights are. I want to get to really quick because I've taken up so much of your time, but I want to get to the border and illegal immigrants and how does the ACLU get involved in that? Because I ask this because we've got someone who's out there in Michigan. I've got the endorsement of the ACLU. Husband works with the ACLU. Like the ACLU is some great organization. It's a horrible thing.
Yeah, so the American Civil Liberties Union, we remember them because they represented Klansmen when in free speech cases years and years ago. And they took this stance where they said, look, we don't agree with these people, but we'll fight for your right to say what you want to say. These days, the ACLU is barely like that at all. I think they have like one or two cases like that, but they are a hard left organization that is pushing the boundaries of policy. And as my book talks about, the ACLU fed staffers into the Biden transition. So there are three groups that I easily identified as being behind the open borders push in the Biden administration. You had night and day. You had Trump with a secure border, and then the very next day, Biden signs his executive orders, establishes catch and release, gets rid of safe third country deals, gets rid of Remain in Mexico. And suddenly you have a huge influx of illegal aliens, so much so that President Biden has to go on TV and say, I'm telling you, illegals, don't come. And it's like, well, yeah, if your policies hadn't already said loud and clear that they should come, you saying don't come is not going to have any impact, because of course it didn't. And we saw upwards of 10 million illegal aliens cross that border and enter this country. And that is comparable to the population of Virginia. Like this is a very serious issue. And anyway, back to the ACLU, because I could wax on the border for a while. But the ACLU sent out a document, and so did the Center for American Progress. They were calling for a new, more humane immigration system. One of the main things they both wanted was to turn the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, into a welcome mat for illegal aliens. And the Center for American Progress said it this way. They said, we need to treat immigration as an asset to be managed rather than a crime to be enforced against. And that mentality, I think, is at the center of what happened in the Biden administration, what caused the border crisis. Because an ACLU and Center for American Progress leaders went in and advised the Biden administration from the very beginning in this direction, and then it took hold. And what do we see now? The ACLU is gearing up to sue Trump and to prevent the mass deportations by any means necessary. And they do this they say that people have rights as soon as they step into the country. But it's like, if you are coming here illegally, you are violating the law by entering this country, you should not have rights in our system. That is itself a crime, and you need to be deported. And I think most Americans understand that. That's why we saw polls showing that people favor mass deportations. Like, people know it's an issue. I grew up in Colorado. I saw that video of the Venezuelan gang going door to door in one of the complexes that wasn't too far away from where I went to high school. And I thought, this isn't my country anymore.
No, and the shock of them saying it was only one apartment building, and JD Vance what a masterclass in looking. Is one okay? Is it okay to have a gang go into one apartment building? I mean, at what point do you realize how stupid you sound? And I think that's what happened in this election. But that's the part that blows my mind when I see these politicians. Now I see the left and all Democrats seem to be kind of flailing. They're like, wait a minute, do I vote for the Lake and Riley Act? Do I not vote for the Lake and Riley Act? Like, can I still preserve who I am and say that I'm okay with people? I mean, we're talking about anybody who crosses the border has broken the law. So if you're an illegal alien, you're a criminal illegal alien. And they're like, well, wait, did you actually commit a crime? Well, you've all committed a crime. But we're talking about some of the most heinous crimes. And they will still not say, yeah, that I think we should get rid of. I mean, they are flailing. This has seemingly backfired on them. It seems like the Woketopus has kind of like strangled them with all of its arms, but we'll see. Maybe they'll get it untangled and they'll continue to thrive. I just think that the other side, the Republican side, needs to get in there and bring some common sense pretty hard. And I'm hoping that we see that soon. But honestly, I've been reading through your book and I'm like, man, if you want to get smart on politics and understand how we got where we are today, because I think so many people are like, how did this happen? It just happened overnight. It didn't happen overnight. You've got to read the Woketopus to totally understand how it occurred and how we can fight back. So I want you to tell people where they can get it and all of the details about the book.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have, it's on Amazon. So just if you go in Google and search Woketopus, it'll be the first result. We're also launching Woketopus.com, where you can follow my Substack and all the articles that I've written about these issues, why this is a continuing threat. Because as you said, the left is on the back foot right now. But I also read an article this week where Alex Soros was saying, I don't think I want to run for Congress or run for office because I have more impact now. And he's saying that right now while Trump is coming into office and while the Democrats feel like they're on the back foot. So the Woketopus is not going anywhere. And I think, unfortunately, we're just going to see the resistance start to form. The legacy media is still finding any way that they can to demonize what Trump is doing in office right now. And even though we saw the Washington Post agree with most of his picks except 4, they're still gearing up to. We know as soon as the mass deportations start, they're going to find every sob story in the book, and they're going to push as hard as they can. So be ready, because there's going to be a massive push from the legacy media, a massive push from these radio stations that George Soros bought, a massive push from these activist groups that's already starting, where they're going to say, no, we need to resist. And the people in the deep state are also going to resist. So the book lays it out. You can go find it on Amazon. Just search the Woketopus. It'll be the first result.
And that massive push has massive money behind it. So you have to learn all about it. You have to figure it out. Tyler O'Neil will help you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Tudor.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us on the Tudor Dixon Podcast. For this podcast and others, go to TudorDixonPodcast.com, the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time. Have a blessed day.